Okay, this is the lecture recap video for the third lecture set. And this one is definitely longer than the other ones so far, so there will be some slides that I skip and just cover really quickly. So please, of course, read those carefully. For the first minor writing assignment, I'll just cover it since I covered in class as well. I didn't have those in the original slides. Really well done. Some formatting issues, so some issues with the header and table numbers and table figures, linguistic words versus prose. So saying something like the word dog in a sentence. This was usually just put regularly for a lot of people. So if we italicize it, we can separate it from the text, or if we put it in quotes, we can separate it from the text. That way we know what's part of the sentence and what's a linguistic word. Some of the introductory sentences and paragraphs were almost too broad for the question, such as introducing what all of Grice's maxims are in detail when the question only asks for one, or saying something like, every language has morphemes, which are the minimal unit of meaning, which, if you're talking about free versus bound morphemes, it's not bad to introduce what morphemes are, but make sure that introductory sentence is about the topic that you're looking at. And then just some punctuation and sentence fragment issues. There's an exercise on Canvas that's auto-graded for this week, and it'll be available until about the end of June. So there are some highlights of some really good openers that I found. So you can read through these just as examples of things that I found that I personally really liked. Some examples of examples. So there's one from the free and bound morpheme. There's one about oral versus nasal stops, and there's one on Grice's maxim of manner below. So nicely formatted, although this table here should really be at the bottom of it. And then some other figures and tables that I found were really nice. So example, with the PP ambiguity paper, these were actually shown in an example here. So in a slide, or in a picture, contrasting the two. And then for the identification of adjectives, there was a chart in one of the papers that listed an English example with meaning, inflection, distribution, as well as French, just to sort of summarize everything that was put in there. So that was very nice. But anyways, this lecture is about phonology and rules. So what are phonemes and allophones, common processes, and rule order? So a phoneme is basically something that a listener or speaker of a language perceives. So you can say that the phoneme is something like a mind or perception kind of thing. So for example, in English, we know that z is mostly always pronounced z, but when we have something like a T, there's multiple different ways to pronounce it. There's the aspirated T that appears in a word like top. There's a glottalized version that some people have, or there's a closed version of T at the end of a word, like in bat, so that T might not be released, but some people would say bat and actually release that T. And so this could be end of word for that one. The aspirated one, it's really the beginning of a stressed syllable. So this little top dash means primary stress, and this is the symbol for syllable. And then we have the regular T, which is everywhere else. And the one that's most commonly found is considered to be the phoneme. So if someone doesn't tell you that these three allophones exist for T, you might not even be aware of them. You might just think of them as T themselves, T itself. And this depends on the language. So there are other languages where the aspirated and unaspirated version are different, like in Korean, for example. Uh, these two words, pul and pool, have different meanings in Korean, but in English, we wouldn't notice a difference because they're not contrastive. So just like with morphemes, allophone simply means other sounds. Phone means sound, allo means other. So we can say there's either one phone or there's multiple allophones. And when we have allophones, we always want to give some sort of environment for those. So here is the IPA chart for all of the consonants we have in English. So in blue, I have those. And then in green, we have some allophones. So I'll just write some words, like in the word symphony, that M is actually pronounced as a labiodental sound, bottom lip, upper tooth. The flap is used in words like either ladder or ladder. So you didn't really hear a difference between those two, ladder and ladder. We don't say ladder, ladder. We just make those into a flap, ladder, really quick against the roof of your mouth. In my name, some people pronounce it with a retroflex, like Trevor. It's a little bit further, a little bit further back, and the tongue has some curling as well. So Trevor versus Trevor. Probably can't hear much of a difference there, but that depends on the speaker. And then we also have the palatal sound in a word like he. So let me actually write this in English there. He. It's not like ha, ha. You don't get that hissing sound with a word like ha or hi or who. We have some vowels here too. So the blue ones are vowels in Canadian English, and then we have the green ones that are part of diphthongs. So we have a vowel a vowel aw, but when we do a sound like I, it's really not the same as either of those. It starts a little bit differently. Some people have wa, so what, dog, on, but most Western Canadian English speakers don't have that. As far as suprasegmentals, so things above the segment layer, above the sound layer, we have some notation that's helpful to memorize because you'll see it in a lot of courses. So things like primary stress and secondary stress shown in the word phonation, sorry, phonetician. So t gets primary stress, pho gets secondary stress. We have a length vowel. So in a word like beat versus bead, there's a slight difference in the vowel itself. So beat, that's really fast. Bead, just a little bit longer. And then we have syllable breaks as well. So the little dots tell you where a syllable boundary is. Now, there's some important properties of consonants and vowels and all these different sounds. There's a reference chart at the very end of the lecture. I'll just talk about the important ones. So the important ones are the places of articulation. We can be a little bit more general with these. So labial sounds are any sounds made with the lips. So bilabial or labiovelar sounds. Sorry, not labiovelar. Labiodental. Labiovelar is categorized partly in labial, partly in this thing called dorsal. Coronal sounds are made with the tongue tip or the tongue blade. So really, the if we were to draw like a tongue here, it would be made with this part of the tongue. So these would be coronal sounds. So things like alveolars, like or even post-alveolars or palatal alveolars, like sh and ch. Dorsal is basically made with the tongue body. So this would be anything really around this point. So in this case, we would have velar sounds like k and g, which are clearly made further back in the tongue than something like k. So a full list is in the reference slide at the back. We have some manners of articulation, and we'll talk really more about obstruent and sonorant right now. So these sounds can be categorized into obstruents and sonorants. So stops, fricatives, and affricants are called obstruents, and liquids, glides, and vowels are called sonorants. So if there's obstruction, this basically just means that there's a difference in air pressure. So when you make a stop, for example, let's say that these are your two lips. What's happening is there's a bunch of air being held behind your lips. So you're getting a lot of air pressure. And then in the real world, well, outside of your lips, there's a little bit less air pressure. So there's a difference in air pressure with the stop. Same if we do a fricative. So just for example, let's say that we're speaking something that's not English that has a bilabial fricative. We still have a lot of air pressure inside, and this air pressure is leaking out into the world, causing this hissing sound. but there is a difference in air pressure there. Sonorants have the same air pressure. So, for example, in a nasal sound, uh, even though the lips are closed, you're redirecting air through your nose, keeping that air pressure the same. Or with a vowel, for instance, I. I mean, if we just draw a mouth with a word like I, so there's like your, do it sort of normal. Your bottom lip is like that, your top lip is like that. So the air pressure inside and outside of your mouth is very similar. So that's the difference in sonorant versus obstruent. And this is relevant for like syllable structures, for instance, and we're not quite doing those or going into that. But those are the important ones here. The rest you can see in the reference slides. So here's a practice exercise, seeing if these sounds all have the same properties or not in terms of voicing, place, manner, and if it's sonorant or nasal. So you can check the IPA chart and try it yourself. I'll go over solutions here. So the second one, these do not have the same voicing. Are voiceless, are voiced. These all have the same general place of articulation. These are all coronal sounds. So even though s is alveolar and sh is postalveolar, the part of the tongue that's producing the sound still falls under that coronal category. What about the manner of articulation? Yes, these are all fricative sounds, so you can hear the hissing when you make them. These are not sonorant sounds, these are fricatives, so the air pressure is different, and these are not nasals. Next one. So yes, these are all voiceless, so I'll write this as VLS for voiceless. These do not have the same place. The P and K are at different parts of the mouth, and there's other ones there that are all in different spots as well. These do not have the same manner of articulation. Is a fricative? Well, it's a stop. These are not sonorants. These are all stops and fricatives, and these are not nasals. What about the next one? And. So yes, nasals in English are always voiced, and the symbols on their own are voiced as well. There can be voiceless versions, and if there were, they'd have a little circle under them to say that they're voiceless. These are not all the same place. We have bilabial, labiodental, alveolar, and velar. They are the same manner, so these are nasal stops. It's sort of like saying hockey, for example. When you just say stops on your own, you imply that it means oral. Just like when we say hockey in Canada, we imply that it means ice. When we want to say we have a different type of stop, like a nasal stop, we qualify it, much like we'd say field hockey if we meant hockey on grass. These are sonorant sounds. These are nasal, so the air pressure inside and outside the mouth is the same. And of course, these are nasal sounds. Ul, w, and y. So these do have the same voicing. These are voiced in English. It is possible to have voiceless L and R. So for example, in the word play, that L is actually voiceless. But again, if it were voiceless, and let me transcribe it, we would actually put the little circle underneath to mean that it's devoiced. That is voiceless. These do not. Do these have the same place of articulation? These do not. So ul, and y are coronal sounds, but w is a labiovelar, meaning that it's a sound made at the lips, and it's a sound made with the back of your tongue. The lips are for rounding, the back of the tongue is where the articulation happens. Are these all the same manner? In this case, no, they're not. We have liquids and we have glides. Are these sonorants? Yes, the air pressure is the same. These are not stops, fricatives, or affricates, so they're sonorant. And these are not nasal. So that was a little bit fast, but again, I'm trying to keep this video under an hour while still covering everything. So if you have questions, as always, you know where to ask them. So let's talk about phonological processes now that we have the background information. Phonological process is basically a phonological rule. They're used interchangeably, and it's explaining the sound changes. So you have what's called a natural class. A natural class is a set of sounds that share some features in common. Maybe in the case of PTK, these are all of the voiceless stops in English. In the case of PBFMV, these are all of the labial consonants in English. And we're just using phonemes. We're not using phones. So we're not including, for example, the labiodental M because we don't consider that a distinctive sound for meaning in English. That's just an M to us. So these are the units in our mind that we perceive as being important for sound. So that's what a natural class is. And then when we have a rule, we take a natural class and then sounds in that natural class change depending on whatever that we have. And we'll see some examples of rules. So for practice, what are these sounds? T, d, n, s, z, l, r. These are all of the alveolar consonants in English. And I just use C as a general abbreviation for consonant. So let's see some examples of rules. So you could say that all voiced oral stops at the ends of words are devoiced. So we ask ourselves, what are the oral stops in English? Well, those are B, D, and G, B, D, G. They're at the ends of words, and we're saying they're devoiced. So I'm going to simplify this a little bit and say that devoicing is the same thing as becoming voiceless. There is a slight difference. So these two sounds are not exactly the same, but functionally we'll say that they are for this example. So if they become voiceless, that natural class BDG then becomes the sounds PTK when it's at the end of a word. Here's another example. All nasal stops assimilate to the same place of articulation as the following consonant. So our nasal stops in English are and they may change their place to whatever the next consonant has. So it could be or So to see this in action, let's take a look at nasal place assimilation. So assimilating means that two sounds become more alike. It's the same assimilation that's used when talking about cultures, how cultures assimilate. So that usually means that one changes and the other stays the same. We don't normally see both sounds changing to accommodate each other, much like in real life. So, for example, the word intelligent, if we talk slowly, this is just a T. We have an N before a T. They're the same place already, so we don't really see a change in fast speech. In a word like input, if we say it slowly, input, we get that N. But if we start talking fast and say input pretty quickly, that N becomes an M. Why? Because the P is bilabial. So what happens is it wants that previous nasal to be bilabial as well. So that N, in this case, is changing to an M before P. In the word like ink, well, ink already has that N in it, so we don't see a change, but we can think about the word incorporate. So if we say incorporate really quickly, we get incorporate. But if we start saying it faster and we say incorporation, incorporate, we might actually get that there. So K is a velar sound, so it wants that nasal to become velar as well. The last example is one I've used before, emphasis. So if we say it slowly, emphasis, we get that M there, but this is what's called a labiodental sound, that F. So it wants the M to become labiodental as well, so we get emphasis. So nasal place assimilation happens in a lot of languages. Consonant deletion is another process, and instead of looking at an actual example of a language, we're going to take a look at the contrast between adult and child speech because children do this a lot for ease of pronunciation, for syllable structure, and so on. So for example, an adult might say road with that D at the end, or cat with that T at the end, but those coda consonants can be really difficult for children to pronounce at first. So they might just delete them altogether and say row or cat. In the case of a two-syllable word, like belly, two syllables with two consonants might be difficult, so they might simplify it. Instead of saying belly, they may say ellie. And with a syllable with a consonant-consonant pair, so two consonants back to back, that can be difficult as well. So either the first or second will be dropped. There's some nuances for how that's determined, not in this course. Take LING 350 for that, but they might drop the T and instead say instead of stay. So that's another process. Vowel reduction is one that we see a lot. So this is where in the base form of a word, like let's say about, we might have about, two vowels that are prominent. But because English has stress, what might happen is syllables in non-stress positions may be reduced. So, for example, in about, that second syllable is stressed, so that first vowel, is being reduced to a neutral vowel, So normally in English, this happens with schwa or with e. So for example, with the word Canada, Canada, you can say Canada, and people know what you're saying. But in speech, we don't really say Canada, we say Canada, Canada. That first syllable is stressed, it retains that a, but the remaining two syllables get neutralized. And it can really depend on how fast you're speaking and what your preferences are for pronunciation. So we can say that the base form is Canada, and then as we talk, we do phonological processes for ease of pronunciation, and those vowels become reduced. So those are three processes that we see in English. So here's a question. How do we determine if two sounds are allophones or separate phonemes if we're looking at another language? So here's an example of Quebecois French. So we have some words and their pronunciations. We have a uvular fricative with the capital R and the lowercase r as a trill. I can pronounce neither of those, but online you can see how those are pronounced. So let's take a look at data sets first. The first concept is a minimal pair. So minimal pair in phonology are two words that differ in exactly one sound. So for example, hill and heel, the only difference is the I versus the E, but also they must have different meanings. So when you say hill and heel, you know that that those two words have different meanings. But imagine I say the word either and I say the word either. Do those words have different meanings? No, either and either are the same word. They both are just spelled like that. They both mean the same thing. So we cannot conclude from this example that those are minimal pairs because they have the same meaning. So if there's minimal pairs, we say it's contrastive and therefore separate phonemes. So in English, we know that E and I are separate phonemes. And we also know in the case of boot and but that oo and are separate phonemes as well. So we can sort of draw these like that. Now, if you don't find minimal pairs, you then look at environments. So here is N and N. So N and N in English. You probably didn't hear much of a difference. The one with the little tooth symbol underneath, or the upper bracket, is called a dentalized N. So that's produced against the back of your top teeth. So what we're going to do is take a look at all of the sounds that are N and N, the dentalized version and the regular version, and just see where they appear. I just highlighted the D. So N, it appears between an I and a T. It appears before an I at the beginning of a word, and it appears after a at the end of a word. So those were those three examples. With the dentalized N, it appears after an E before a th, and it appears after an before a th. So if we could come up with some generalization, we would probably say or notice that this occurs before the interdental th. And if we think about these two sounds are interdental. They're made between your two teeth. So when you're getting ready to produce that th sound, you're shifting your nasal up a little bit. You're shifting that alveolar sound up a little bit in preparation for pronouncing that. While the other case, we don't really see a nice generalization, so we'd say that's the elsewhere environment. So if we're drawing a little chart, the elsewhere is the main phoneme, and then the other two are allophones. and then we have their environments. We can also see from this data set that the D occurs very similarly to the N. So it becomes dentalized before th, and we can speculate that that's because it's an alveolar stop. So it's behaving the same as the other alveolar stop. So with you can if we were to say an alveolar with, that D would be pretty far back at the alveolar ridge, but instead it's much more forward because you're getting ready to produce with month. Okay, so going back to this one, are these allophones or separate phonemes? Well, first we hunt for minimal pairs. And it looks like we have a minimal pair here with these two words, but they have the same meaning. Therefore, these aren't actually minimal pairs. Instead, this is something called free variation. This is much like the either or either example where people have a choice. So for the sake of our analysis, not actually going to take a look at these two words, we'll take a look at everything else to determine if they're allophones. So let's set up a chart for the voiced jugular fricative and the alveolar trill. So for the voiced jugular fricative, we have a few words here. It occurs after an at the end of a word. It occurs between an e and a b. It occurs at the beginning of the word before an a. And in the last one, it occurs before this rounded e. And it also occurs between a and d. So I don't really see any nice pattern to describe where that occurs. But what about the trill? Well, that occurs in one word. So that's going to be before an O and after a T. So if we think about this, we do only have one case where this occurs, so we can come up with some sort of analysis, but we have to think about what's relevant. And I would say this occurs after a T, and the other one is elsewhere, simply because this is an alveolar trill. So the fact that it occurs after another alveolar, which is t, makes sense. It's for pronunciation. It's a lot easier to say, I can't pronounce it, tl, I can't do it. But they're both at the same spot. So there's some reason for why that occurs. So if we were to draw this out, we would consider the voiced jugular fricative as the phoneme because it's the most common one. And then we have two allophones there with their respective environments. Here's another example. So let's check to see if S and Z are allophones of the same phoneme. First, we look for minimal pairs. Hint, we don't see one. So therefore, we start a chart. So let's take a look at all of the S words. So I've dashed them there. So one occurs at the beginning of a word before an A. Another one occurs at the end of a word after an O. One occurs between O and T. One occurs at the beginning of a word before O, and another one occurs at the end of the word after A. In terms of Z, we have this in a few words. So in one case, it appears between E and A. Another word, it appears between O and E. And another one, it occurs between E and A. So I don't see any nice generalizations for the S sound, but I do see one for Z. And that is that Z occurs between vowels. So that must mean that our S is our elsewhere condition. So between vowels, does this make sense? Well, first of all, let's draw our little chart just for the sake of completion. Does this make sense? Well, yeah, it kind of does, because vowels are voice sounds. So when it's between two vowels, it's simply maintaining the voice. So instead of lisse, it's lise, because you can maintain that voicing. So that would be the analysis there, and we're just looking at S and Z here. But we could take it a bit further, and we could say, well, based on our prediction, voiceless consonants become voiced between vowels. So we can make a prediction and generalize and then test. So here's some questions based on the between vowels analysis. Would we have atom or adom? Well, the D here is between two voiced vowels, so we would predict adom. What about sika or siga? Again, we have two vowels, so we would expect that consonant to be voiced. What about plot versus plod? Well, we're looking at the end of a word, so we would expect something voiceless that's elsewhere. So we could check in the data, and if we highlight all of the other voice sounds, what we notice is that they're always between vowels. And if we take a look at other voiceless sounds, like the T in mosta, that's not between two vowels. In fact, that's the only one that we have really. So we can make a prediction and we can test it if we have more data, but at least we can think about things and try to give reasons as to why this occurs. So that's an important skill for later linguistics courses. So now we can think about rules. So before we just described environments, now we can think about actual rules. So we're not going to use features, we're just going to use some simple diagrams and some words. So here's a rule. A vowel is epenthesized, also meaning inserted, between two voiced consonants. And for the sake of the example, I'm going to use the schwa. So I might actually write this to help me out as CC becomes C, C, just so I have a picture. And I might put plus voy below each C, just so I know the conditions that we're working with. So that would be a rule. So let's say we had a word like bazd. That would mean that it would become bazd because we have a voiced consonant with Z and a voiced consonant with D. Here's another rule. A consonant pair takes the same voicing as the following consonant, a consonant takes the same voicing as the following consonant in a CC pair. So if we have a CC, no matter what the voicing is, so whether it's plus or minus voice, that is going to spread to the previous consonant. So if we had something like SD, it would become ZD. Instead of SD, we'd get ZD. So those are two rules as an example. Now, how can we apply them? Well, what if both of these rules occurred in a language together? There might be a difference depending on which rule that we use first. So what if rule 1 is applied first, then 2? Or what if 2 is applied first and then 1? Do we get different outcomes? And if so, we need to figure out what the correct ordering is. So here is a diagram or a table that shows our rule process. So again, we had the case of CC becoming CS, so that was rule 1. And then we had voicing spread. So I'm just going to repeat those there. So these are all plus voiced consonants for the first rule, and whatever the voicing is for the second consonant, that spreads to the first. Okay, so what we can do is we can start with underlying forms, apply rules, and see what we get. So the first one is 1 then 2, and the second set is 2 to 1. So the first one, zzz. First we do a penthesis. And we don't have any voiced consonants back to back, so we don't apply a penthesis, nothing changes. But then we have voice assimilation. So Z is voiced, S is voiceless, so this is going to become Zis. So we change that S to be voiced, just like the following consonant, so we end up with Zis. Now let's say we do the rules in the opposite order. And first we do voice assimilation. So first, that Z is going to make that S voiced, so we get Zis. And now we do a penthesis. Well, now we have two voiced consonants back to back, so we can apply a penthesis and we can get Zis. So now our output is Zis. And what we see here is that the outputs are different. So rule order makes a difference. What we would have to do is we'd have to check the language, we'd have to check speakers to see what they actually pronounce. If they pronounce Zis, then the first table better describes the rules. If they pronounce Zis, then the second table better describes the rules. If we do the example with bedos, we actually see that no matter which order we do, we end up with the same output. So it's bedos in both cases, because voicing assimilation doesn't actually apply to either of the underlying form bedos, because they're already voiced. So it doesn't work on all rules, on all words. We have to check a bunch of different words. Some of them won't change, but some of them will change. So here's another example. Suppose you have bead, So there's bead. We'll do it twice because we're going to do 2 tables. Voice, so rule 1 is voiced consonants at the beginning of words are devoiced. And then we have voiced consonant at the ends of words are devoiced. So let's do 1, 2, and let's do 2, 1, and see if there's a difference. So 1 says the voiced consonant at the beginning becomes devoiced. So we get peed. And 2 says the consonant at the end becomes devoiced. So we get peat. So our final output, if we do 1 then 2, is peat. Now what if we do it in the reverse order? So we do the end first. So first let's devoice the end. We get beat. Now let's devoice the beginning, and we get peat, and our output's the same. So rule order does not matter in this case. And this makes sense because a voiced consonant is at the beginning, a voiced consonant at the end. They target 2 completely different parts of the word. Now let's try a different one. Let's try Canadian raising. So in Canadian English, we do raising for some speakers. So I pronounce writing and riding differently. There's a different vowel there. Right, ride, right, ride. Americans might just say ride, right, and ride. I can barely do it. Riding and riding. So they sound the same if you're American. So 2 rules cause this. One is we have a vowel change, so vowel raising, I to I, before a voiceless C. So that should really be the square brackets there, and these should be in cases of minus voice. We also have a rule that if we have 2 vowels, so V to V, sorry, a VTV for vowels, that's not a V, it becomes a flap. And this is either a T or a D. So let's check the order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy these words over to the next page, and we'll do the rule ordering there. So let me insert a page so we can see both. Okay, so we have the raising rule, just to put them up there. So 1 is going to be I becomes I, and this is before a voiceless consonant. And rule number 2 says if you have VDV or VTV, what you get is the flapped version. So I'm just going to do writing. I'm not going to do riding, but you can do that one yourself if you'd like. But in advance, I know there's not going to be a difference there. So let's do 1, 2 and 2, 1 and see what happens. So the first one, if we do 1 first, it says that the vowel raises before a voiceless consonant. So we have I before the voiceless consonant T. So what we see is we see some raising. So we get writing. Then 2, we're going to get some flapping. So yes, we have a T between 2 vowels. So we're going to end up with writing. So our output has raising in it. Now, what if we change the order? What if we do flapping first? Well, we have a D between 2 vowels, so we can do some flapping to get riding. Now, if we do raising, well, this flap is voiced. So we don't have a vowel before a voiced consonant, so nothing changes. What we end up with is riding. So the example on the left, if we do 1 then 2, that's Canadian raising. That's Canadian speakers. The one on the right, well, there's no raising. That's just writing. That's the word writing turning into riding. So you can almost think of this as being American English, while the one on the left is Canadian English. So that'd be an example of Canadian raising. So on the next writing assignment, which is due on the 1st or 2nd, I believe it's the 2nd, this is the task that you'll be asked to do, as well as giving a quick process for a short data set. Now let's talk about writing about data sets. Kept this under 40 minutes so far. This is good. I'll try to keep this under 50. So if you want to write in Phonology or see some other resources, I have a couple here. The first one is the site for typing the characters. It's great. It has all of them. It's a simple copy and paste into a document. And then there's also a quick PDF about writing up rules for phonology problems from Isaac Hayes, which is the writer and author of one of the better phonetics and phonology textbooks that exists out there. So please check those out if you're interested. So what you'll see is that the writing in phonology and morphology isn't that different. Um, it's just analyzing theoretical data. It's just explaining data. You might have some rule ordering differences. When you talk about that, you're of course explaining a different phenomenon, but the core writing principles, formatting, all that stuff is exactly the same. So instead of just looking at three different pieces and focusing on how they do things, we're going to take a look at pieces from different time periods and look at the consistency across all of the different articles. So the first one is Kawahara, 2015, pitch contrast in Japanese. So there's some explanation at the beginning, of course. And what I like about this is they show minimal pairs. So in one, they have a bunch of minimal pairs to show contrast, and it even shows the minimal pairs and describes them below. So this is pretty recent, and we can see minimal pairs are still used in writing. This isn't some technique that you're going to toss away in the future. The technique of using minimal pairs to find separate phonemes and separate processes is something that will always exist. In Loretta Mascaro, I don't know how to pronounce these names, I'm sorry, 2007, about 8 years prior, we see some writing about contrasts in Spanish. So in one, there's an introduction to what you're about to look at. There are some contrasts in sounds as well as different words. So you can find minimal pairs. And then we also see some with the laterals as well. So ol and the other one, which I cannot pronounce. Finally, in two, it shows things that just cannot work. And it describes what X is. It, of course, introduces it in text. So it's all related to what you're about to read. So in two, they put the little star there to mean that it is not permissible. So the next one is a bigger jump back in time to 1974, and this one has some rules here. So there's some introduction to what is being discussed. This is in the middle of a section, so we don't really have a nice introductory sentence here, but we do have the beginning of what I believe, sorry, it's not the beginning of a paragraph, it's midway through the paragraph, but there's some explanation of what you're going to read. And in 11, we actually see a rule ordering here. So we see stress occurring first, then neutralization. What those mean at this point isn't really important, but we can see that these are applied. It also discusses how and what you're reading. So it says illustrative partial derivations are given in 11, then it describes those derivations. So the rules and the orderings. And then it even describes what you just saw. In short, the only rule that applies to root vowels in the forms marked U and 2 is the general rule of neutralization 10. So it's referring to things previously in the text that aren't here, but these are things that you could find and you'd be able to go back and reference. So when we think about this, there's not really a difference in the writing styles between the two. It still shows minimal pairs when needed. It still describes the data. It still introduces it. It still explains it. The writing style hasn't really changed since 1974. We are looking at something slightly different here, but we do see the examples indented. We see them laid out nicely. And of course, we see numbering of examples in text. So that's been fairly consistent. And the third one is really an opinion question. So which do you think formats data in the best way? And this is where you're going to come in and, decide what you like and hopefully adopt that in your writing. So for me personally, I like this example. This is a very nice example. I also like the one in Kawahara as well. The one thing I don't like about Kawahara is just the closeness of these descriptions to the actual word itself. It clutters it up a little bit, and what you're really looking at is difference in pitch. So these little apostrophes here with pitch differences are a little bit hard to see. Now, you could do this in a table and space them out a little bit. You could, well, what could you really do? it's hard to suggest something that you could do to make this stand out more. Some people might use capital letters to denote pitch. So all capital letters, like for instance, you could do ame versus ame, and maybe that makes it easier to read for some people. It really depends. So there's, some things they could have done. Honestly, it's fine. This is just personal preference at this point. But what I really like about this is just how clear everything is. You can see the contrast between these sounds. In fact, it's lined up so well. You don't really even need to know what you're reading from the paragraphs to understand what you're looking at if you understand what a minimal pair is. Same with pollo or pole and chicken. So I like those two. This is all right. Again, you're just showing the rules. The text, the font is different. It's an older font for sure that's not really used. Um, there's nothing really wrong with this. It's just, you know, it's older. I don't like the font that much. So I can't really criticize it. I can't really suggest anything to improve it. It's done correctly. It's done well. It's just older, and that's a personal preference. So if we're going to write about our rule ordering, what should we do? How should we outline it? Of course, we have to introduce it. So we'd probably say something about Canadian English and raising in a topic sentence. We would definitely introduce the rules. We would probably give some examples, and then we would probably write about the ordering, for example. So we'd show what happens if we do 1, 2, and 2, 1, and then we'd make some conclusion about ordering which one's correct. So that would be how I would approach this. Of course, in class, we might come up with different ways, but this is just something that makes sense to me. Introduce all the information you need to know, what the phenomena is, what it looks like, what the rules are, and then go into your discussion about which one would come first. So, which is it rule one that comes first, or rule two, or does order even matter at all? If you wanted to expand on this, then maybe you could talk about the differences between Canadians and Americans. So, which rule applies to Canadians, which rule applies to Americans. But that's only if the research question or the task asks you to do that comparison. So, for writing assignment 3, your task is to find phonological patterns and explain rule ordering. Again, this is just more continuation of analysis, looking at it from something that's not morphology, looking at it in another area. So you have a data set, te, ka, ta, pere, and shin, becoming de, ga, da, pere, and jin. So one process applies to all of these 5 words. And then you have some rule orderings. So you have voice assimilation. So one says if you have a CC pair, the plus or minus voice spreads to the next consonant. And the other one says that if you have a nasal and a G, that G gets deleted and the nasal stays the same. So I've given you some example words and what they should come out to for you to test those. So that's this assignment, that's this video. I kept under 50 minutes. That's incredible because it's taken 4 hours of lecture to get through. So if you have any questions, I know it's rushed, but I'm really trying to keep these condensed because it's a lot of time, extra time outside of the course to make them. And also, if they're too long, they're just a little bit hard to get through. The attention span, of course, when you're listening on your own is tough. So if you have any questions, you know where to contact me. And I'll see you for the next one.